Hello from Wiltshire. I'm Liz Webster, the founder of Save British Farming. And here I am today presenting another podcast along with my friend and colleague,
Uh,
Ollie
Ollie, F-
Fletcher.
Ollie Fletcher of the Farming Explained YouTube channel, beaming in all the way from Leicestershire, where I'm going to get more sheep tomorrow, which is something that I am excited about, but my mother is not.
More sheep, more sheep. Ah, I can't wait. Can't wait to see the pictures.
Yes, it
That's
should
the
be
sheep.
good. One for the Instagram. Yeah. They love it. They love it. What are we talking about today, Liz?
Let's talk about farming. That's usually what we end up talking
Well, it is,
about.
but what more specifically? That's a very broad topic.
I think we should talk about why has British farming had such a difficult time? And a part of that is actually the Brexit vote from the farming community, because a lot of the farmers that voted Brexit actually thought that British farming had suffered because of our EU membership. And that conclusion is wrong, and we can show that. I can show that.
You're going to show that. This is like an essay, isn't it? You have to state your hypothesis at the start, what you're going to say, and then you're going to say it. So the argument today is going to be we can demonstrate that Brexit was not. No, I'll rephrase. The argument today is going to be that the European Union was not damaging for farming because Britain before the European Union was even worse. Is that where this is going?
It's not that it was even worse before we joined the European Union. It was, we'd gone through a very difficult period before we joined the European Union, and we joined the European Union because we had problems with food security. But mostly, I mean, the
Was that
economy
a
was
key? Was
bad.
that a key driver? This is before my time.
It was a key driver of the decision because we lost the empire. The empire used to feed us prior to that. So the decision to sort of try and get stability of food and food prices, food supply, was definitely intrinsic in the decision to join the European Union. Yes. And don't forget, it took 10 years to try and to actually accede to the European Union,
Mm.
because Jacques Delors famously kept saying no, mainly because of our connections to America. And
Yeah, I
nothing
have
really has
noticed that
changed.
the Gaullist anti-American sentiment in France has sort of become more pronounced once again, I feel, in recent months. But I think actually that's something quite sympathetic. I agree. I don't want to alienate any American listeners, but I respect the French for that. They're principled.
Look, ultimately, we had a good time after the war because we had a government that understood they needed to invest in food production, because we had terrible food shortages and we had food rationing. But as that was going on, the empire was falling away and we lost control of our food supply, and the decisions had to be made to try and stabilize that. And
Mm.
that's why we wanted to join the European Union. And it meant a lot of stability for farmers because we went into a bigger system. It wasn't as protective or protectorate as we had in the pre-EU period, where we were having big grants and big money was going into food production to try and keep the economy and stable, and keep the public fed. But the EU largely was formed from really a British idea, and that's what we ended up going into. And the reason that British farming has suffered, particularly since 1964, is the rise of the supermarkets. And that began when Tory Prime Minister Alec Douglas Home was lobbied by Tesco, which was really beginning to expand. And they persuaded him to repeal this legislation, which stopped uh, supermarkets and processors from buying produce below the cost of production. And that piece of legislation was called the Resale Price Maintenance Act. And it was repealed in 1964. And to this day, France still have a similar mechanism, which is why food has been more expensive in France, and why their farming has not crashed as ours has, and we've had smaller farms being rolled into bigger farms.
Mm.
So that's what caused it. It was a decision in 1964. That is when British farming was thrown to the wolves. But unfortunately, the muscle memory from that has been lost. People don't really remember it. And we had a supermarket revolution much faster than any of the other European countries. And people rejoiced in being able to go shopping in one place and buy everything all in one place. And that's why British farming has suffered, not because of the European Union membership. In fact, that opened up export markets, huge export markets, particularly for sheep. So if you look at the sheep numbers since we joined the EU, absolute huge rise in sheep numbers in this country, which helped, especially in the Welsh valleys where the mines were closing and sheep production, has ensured that people have been able to make some money and
Mm.
keep the valleys going.
Yeah, but
So
this, you could take what you've just said and argue that Brexit has little or nothing to do with it because, as I understand it, you'll know more about European Union policy than me. The European Union agricultural policy was based on fundamentally the same principles as the British post-war settlement, which is you socialise agriculture, provide cheap food, but also maintain small farms as a sort of cultural asset, and that feeds into the character of a nation and a place and whatnot. But you're suggesting that we diverged from that in 1964 before we joined Brexit, before we joined the European Union, and France took a different path by maintaining their similar legislation, which obviously would suggest that that is outside of the European Union's food policy, and there, as such, this has little to do with Europe at all.
look, I mean, Europe's been through a revolution and ramping up changes. So I'm not an expert in French domestic laws, but I do know that they've got legislation which protects producers. But ultimately, 1964, when we gave power to the supermarkets, they weren't really a threat because they were still small. The supermarkets didn't really start getting going until the mid 80s. And so in the mid 80s, the European Union had already really formulated into something quite big, and it was moving towards Maastricht Treaty. And if you remember, in 1984, that is when the inheritance tax exemption first came in. And that was largely about creating a level playing field. So it was a negotiation. We've got this and you've got that. And so to make sure that it's fairer for everybody, we think you should do this. And every single European nation has got a slightly different situation in terms of what they are providing for their domestic agriculture in that type of legislation. But the idea of the European Union is to ensure that monopolisation cannot happen easily, which is the taking back control was always there for the big beast, not the small beast, because it is that protection for small business that the big business doesn't like. And that's where the friction is between America and the European Union.
Mm.
So in America, most of their agriculture is controlled by 4 or 5 big conglomerates. That's it. And when you compare that to France or Germany, it blows your mind because obviously it's controlled by a patchwork of small farms. And that's why Donald Trump doesn't like the European Union, because he thinks that it should be a kleptocracy, oligarchy, where you have big business just saying, "Well, we don't care about what the people think. We just bulldoze over everything," like he showed what he wants with Gaza. That's how they see progress. That it's just a bulldozering through of everything to be the biggest and the showiest, and they don't have any connection to history. They just want to keep going forward. And that's
Yeah.
different for us. Our culture is very different to that.
Yes. Yeah, I agree, but I think at the same time, there's quite a strong argument to be made that because of the repeal of the resale price maintenance act, I'm speaking terribly today, the settlement that we have in this country and arguably in Europe more widely doesn't really work either, which I think is something that is often quite common in government, where you have a settlement that's drawn up. So in this country, you had the subsidies for food, you had the like price controls, guaranteed prices, all this sort of stuff for farmers. But that was a system that was designed in the coming out of the Second World War without supermarkets. So supermarkets came and disrupted it because suddenly you had these really big, powerful processing companies. You had all this bargaining power and money to lobby politicians. Whereas before that, obviously, you had your independent butchers and
Don't
bakers and
forget
whatnot.
McDonald's.
And McDonald's, yes. So this has in a sense disrupted the entire system, and you still have subsidies for farmers that in previous times would have been passed on more directly to small independent businesses like butchers and then onto the consumer, whereas the supermarkets can just sponge these subsidies out of the farmers by lowering the prices and then take it as profit essentially, which doesn't really work. And this is something you see almost just across government, and I think is a strong case for constant critical thinking about the systems that we have, because you need to reform the whole sector to address that. I feel. I mean, maybe you could make the case that we just need that specific piece of legislation back in, and you just need to ensure that the supermarkets pay farmers a fair price, which in theory should negate any need for subsidy and therefore be easier for the government. I don't know.
We know that we need subsidy because of our geographic location. We can't compete with the Americans and big growers with big land and better weather than us. We just can't. So it has to be subsidised. We prove that.
Do you think that there's no world in which you could regulate to solve British farming's problems?
No, I think it's, we've got a very large population on a small island. To be able to, if we wanted to be like North Korea and put up all the walls and look after ourselves, it's impossible. We can't produce our own energy, and we can't produce our own food. So there's no way we can get to that unless a lot of people are killed.
Right. So you're saying
And
there's got to be some degree of competition on
there's
an international
there's got
market,
to
and
be.
therefore
We have
it has to be
imported food
subsidised.
here for hundreds of years, and that's what needs to happen, because we can't produce food, particularly all foods, 12 months of the year anyway. So we've got no choice but to do that. Otherwise, we go back to sort of, you know, pre Henry VIII's day. You're the historian,
Mm.
but
Yeah, yeah, yeah. A return
you
to
know.
peasantries.
so so there's no way we could go back to that, and so we do need trade, and we had a better trading position within the EU in the single market because it's a big block, and it was able to put up barriers to stop substandard foods coming in here and undercutting our producers. And it
Yeah,
was
but again,
always.
that's regulation rather than subsidy.
It's not.
If
It's to do with negotiations and trade deals. You cannot, as a small country, and this is where a lot of people that say we haven't got the right Brexit are wrong. You cannot, as a small country with 68 million people, which is what it's worked out on, negotiate with Donald Trump, who's got, I don't know what the population in America is, close to 400,000. And sort of say, give us a good deal, Trump. I mean, there's just no way, And they're already massively powerful in Congress with all of the agricultural lobby. They'll be saying, no, 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 we want this. We come first. Their machine is built in a very different way to ours. But ultimately, we lost our connection with food. Some time ago, we used to be leaders in Europe in terms of food because, we led the spice wars. We were actually experimental with food, but we lost that in getting an empire and allowing food to just come in here from the other side of the world. And then we lost our ability, our self-sufficiency. And then we had 2 world wars where we nearly starved.
mm,
So, but in that, what I've always recognized, or what I fear with where we are, is that the repeal of the Corn Laws did that, didn't it? It ended up with the prairies being developed and the imports coming in and ensuring an agricultural depression here. And Brexit is doing that to us now. And America's here threatening us with a trade deal, or Starmer is, with Trump and cozying up. And the same thing will happen again. And the policy that the Labour government have got actually, it mows the field ready, it mows the pitch ready for that. And then we're going to be exposed again potentially, because it's not a long-term policy, it's a short-term policy. China is actually setting their food policies for the next century. They have been stockpiling food and thinking about where they get resources for the long term. And everything that we seem to do seems to be very short term, 5 years at a go. And there is no long-term policy for food in this country. And really in Europe, you could probably say the same. It's weaker than ever, and it's being weakened by big business. And probably Brexit
Mm.
hasn't helped. The Ukraine war hasn't helped.
Yeah, I spent the morning reading a report by Professor Tim Lang for the National Preparedness Commission, I believe it's called, on how we deal with this, because the government has completely neglected any um, plan for how the food supply shall be maintained in any sort of crisis. And he interestingly suggests you go the opposite way. So he wants local, I forget exactly what he calls them, but local food resilience committees. So you empower people within communities to decentralize the food supply, essentially. So you put more emphasis on community gardens, and caterers can use their equipment to cook stuff en masse for people if they need to do that, and you create links between local government and farms and make sure more people have access to land, all this sort of stuff. It democratize the food system essentially, which I thought was interesting because it goes against this corporatization of food that we're seeing at the moment, but also in a way that sort of bypasses government. He was saying that you need to link communities together. It's very communitarian. It's
Well,
all saying.
I think that it's another nice sounding campaign headline, but it's not anchored in reality, because we're not, everything that we get to grow food pretty much comes from Europe, and we've still got these blinking trade barriers which make it really difficult and expensive. And so what he's talking about actually is what we had pre the supermarkets when I was growing up. That's, we did have community allotments and growers that you could buy local food. It was before the supermarkets. That's what we had. And so he's talking about going back to more of that kind of system, which I agree. I think we do need that, but we need a lot of investment on local abattoirs. Don't forget, they've all been
Mm.
rolled into massive abattoirs, and none of that exists. And it needs huge investment and a huge plan, rather than just a fantasy wish list in a report,
Yes,
which
yeah,
makes people
yeah.
feel, I like that. Yes, I agree with that. I mean, you're scared to read the food security report, then you read his recommendations. But I'm not seeing that from government. I'm seeing Keir Starmer sat holding hands with Donald Trump, and we're going to do a nice fast trade deal and wallop. That will be it. And you only have to look at Mexico and what happened to Mexico when they signed NAFTA to know what's coming.
Yeah, I do agree, but I presume that the argument he would make is that irrespective of what Keir Starmer and Donald Trump do, if you have a food resilient community, then the community will be food resilient. Although, my takeaway was that the reason people don't have allotments so much anymore, and they don't keep two pigs in their garden for their food waste and whatnot, is because they can't be bothered, essentially. And that is a much larger hurdle, I think, to overcome than
I don't
any
think it is because
logistical problem.
I don't think it's because they can't be bothered. I think it's because it's not cheap. It's really expensive. You need
Yes,
money.
that
You
as
need
well. No,
funding.
yes, yeah. Well, it
Huge
takes
expense.
time. It takes time. Like having a garden, say, I think you could save money doing it, but it's a time investment, which then obviously time is money.
There's the time aspect of it, but I think there's also the cost aspect of it. It's really expensive to grow food.
Yes, yeah. Which is why I think again this is why in the First and Second World Wars you had the war ags, which was to empower and subsidize farmers to produce as much food as possible and then distribute it. And that was the path they went down, which is slightly different from his approach. Although I think there are some similarities, but I think that is something that is accessible to all people, even if they don't have the time, willingness, money, etc., to themselves become involved in the food supply, which I think is more realistic. I think it's much more likely to achieve that again if we needed to, rather than to have some sort of crisis and then demand that everybody sort of organize into community groups and start having orchards again, which would be lovely and I would fully support it, but I'm just not sure it would happen.
My own view is if this continues to happen and we sign an American trade deal, is that we will be in the zone of the masses eating mass produced foods full of chemicals that are banned here, using methods which make you, give you nightmares. And that I think a food community system hub could be set up, but I think only the wealthy will be able to afford it.
Well, yeah, you do see it at the moment, and it tends to be a very middle class thing. Well, that's always the impression I get anyway. When you go to the nice market towns, and they have a little eco hub where you can, get your organic foods in your refillable containers and whatnot. But it's not something that ordinary people do so much, I don't believe.
No, I mean, I'm looking, I live near Swindon and we've already had this American farm food, which is even more basic than Lidl and Aldi and Iceland. It really is, very cheap food. And I can only just seeing that being rolled out more and more. And more people are becoming poorer and they're then forced into having to use this to eat that sort of food, which is horrendous. Um, the reason that longevity has really progressed since the war is mainly because of the advancement in food, and I mean, obviously, medical care as well, but the two together. And we're now going backwards. And that is to do with diet and lack of access to good healthcare, which
Yeah.
is which is regressive and horrible, and I don't like it. But look at longevity in America; it's appalling, and it's because of their food and their
Yeah.
healthcare, which only the rich can afford.
And the
Um,
fact that they never had a resale price maintenance act, which was the beginning of all of this.
well, we could say the beginning was somewhere all the way through, but the beginning of everything in Britain really since the war, okay, let's focus on since the last war, is that we dictated really once the war had ended, that Germany have a proportional representation system, and Europe largely has, most of the countries have some form of voting system like that, apart from us and Belarus. We have first past the post. And the problem with first past the post is that it's very easy for big donors to play one party off against the other. And that can be demonstrated with the decision on the Beeching railway cuts, which McAlpine lobbied the government. The Beeching report came through. They told us we couldn't afford the railways anymore, a bit like the black hole story. And Bob's your uncle, the M1 was built, and then everyone was told to get a car.
Yeah.
And that's
No,
how we
yeah.
ended up where we are,
I,
gridlocked.
I do think that's very similar to what's happening at the moment with farming, because we this week went to the National Farmers Union conference and we saw Steve Reed and Paul Johnson, who's the head of the Institute for Physical Studies, talk about farming. And they essentially said that farms are not very profitable and this is a problem because it's holding back growth. But the reason for that isn't because we're inefficient, as they would suggest, but because we don't have a resale price maintenance act and the supermarkets crushes into the ground, which is something I've talked about on my channel.
He
So
didn't
when
mention the resale price maintenance act, actually.
no, they didn't. But it's the issue in farming is that you don't choose your own price. So when we used to milk cows here, we'd have a price dictated to us, which would then often be adjusted downwards without our consultation or consent. And then we would have to adjust our operation to meet that price, which means we would get more and more and more efficient, which we had to do to stay afloat, but we would make no money. So we would have all of this capital invested in the business, the animals, the machinery, the land. And land, of course, particularly is very valuable at market, but then we would be making no return with this capital. So if you're an economist looking at a GDP per capita graph, we're holding that back. We're not doing too well. We've got all this capital invested. We're making no money. So their attitude seems to be these businesses, there's no place for you in the future if you're not profitable, Steve Reed said, which I think is to fundamentally misunderstand how free market economics work with homogenous goods. We don't set a price. There's very little we can do to alter how much money we get. We can become more efficient, and farmers do that. But ultimately, if the price is pushed down to a certain point, you're not going to make money whatever you do. And I think this is the same as what happened with beaching, although I'm not an expert on that, in that they essentially saw that that sector, in this case the railways, was run into the ground, and then went, well, it's not making any money, so we'll get rid of it, which is exactly what's happening with farming. But the problem is not that farming is failing at all, it's because it's being mismanaged, which is something that needs to be sorted out.
Well, there is such a thing as political economics, isn't there? And they use the politics to manipulate the economics to make things appear and to justify the political decisions that they want. And that is really disaster capitalism or disaster political decisions of whatever it is. And
Well, it is, and it's
I
coming
think
from the
we've
Labour
made
Party.
terrible decisions. If we hadn't got behind the beaching carts, then we would still have one of the best railways in the world. And now we're all gridlocked because we don't have a decent railway. And it is mainly because of first past the post, too much corporate power able to buy the decision makers, and then short-term decisions are made in a panic, and that's where we are. And now here we are facing the reality that we're going to roll from being within the European Union and a powerful voice within the European Union as we were, to being a vassal state of America.
Mm. It is. It's like Orwell's vision in 1984, because in that world you have China, Russia, and America as the sort of leaders of a third of the planet, and then Britain is airstrip one, just sort of bolted onto America, and it does feel like that's what we're becoming.
Yeah, it's yeah, well we'll see if it actually happens. There is one obstacle to Starmer's
Yes.
trade vision, is that there is a judicial review pending into the Australia deal, and that has been winding its way through the courts because it got lost, and that is going to come to court next week because Starmer's government appealing its right to a cost capping order, which is basically trying to derail the judicial review altogether. But one hopes that the courts don't do such a thing. But if this judicial review is successful, it will mean that the Labour government will have to literally re-evaluate the trade deals that the Conservatives agreed, and do it properly with
Yeah. So
impact
so
assessments
I this
and
is something
parliamentary scrutiny.
this is something that I don't understand as well as you. So there's the Australian trade deal, which is terrible, particularly for British food, but also the environment and a whole host of other things. This was signed by Boris Johnson when he was drunk, as I understand it, and there someone is trying to challenge that, but because they're a charity, they have a cost capping order, so they don't get bankrupted by the court costs. And the government's trying to remove that so that they can be bankrupted and they stop doing it. Is that what's happening?
In essence, yes, in simple terms, that's exactly what's happening. So when they got permission for this judicial review,
Who's
when
they?
the Feedback is the name of the group, they're an
Right.
NGO, a non-government association. And their passion, their their whole thing is about the environment. And
Mm.
they got permission, and then as soon as the Labour government took over, Steve Reed stood in Parliament and was, he grandstanded and made promises that never again would farmers be undercut by terrible Tory trade deals. That's what he said on the one hand. Then, behind the scenes, that he must have looked on his desk and the civil servants must have said, well, Mr. Reid, the problem going forward is this judicial review. What can we do about it? Well, we need to get rid of it. How do we get rid of it? Well, they've got this cost capping order. They're not very rich, they don't have much money, and that will stop them doing it. And so the reason that I want people to get behind it is because if the courts do take away the cost capping order, they will need to crowdfund. And we, as the British public, have a lot to lose in having an American diet. So
Mm.
whatever
So
you vote and whatever you believe in, everyone who believes in good, healthy food and having food security should get behind this judicial review.
So
And also, we
we
want parliamentary control, because there's been no parliamentary control of this trade deal or any of the trade deals because they've been allowed to go to bypass Parliament through these Trade and Agriculture Commission, which is headed up by Shankar Singham, who's very much an engineer of the New World Order. Oh, here comes Meg.
so
And
so we need this review to go through because that will set a precedent that will then make it difficult for the Labour Party to do a free trade agreement with America.
I really hope that the judicial review succeeds and that they've got powerful legal arguments, which, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know, I understand enough of the law to know what they're saying. But when the legal arguments happen in the court themselves, we never know what it's going to say. But the arguments themselves need to be pushed through the courts. And we will then be able to examine, and there'll be plenty of studies done on that hearing, as there are on all judicial reviews. And there'll be plenty of moments for academics to study and scrutinise this process. So in the hearing happening itself, I can understand why the Labour government, who've come in thinking, yeah, let's do a deal with Donald Trump, go, oh my God, we don't want this hearing to happen. Of course they don't. Whether it wins or loses, the
Mm,
process of hearing those arguments is going to be embarrassing for the Labour government, who said that never again would we have to suffer Tory trade deals when they're intent on protecting Tory trade deals. So it's absolutely infuriating that they are playing such a double-faced game here and being complete hypocrites.
mm,
And a lot of their followers probably can't really believe that that's actually what they're doing, but it is what they're doing. And it's so important that we get behind this, because if the cost capping order is taken away from them, they're going to need to do a really quick crowdfunding exercise, and they will need everybody who wants healthy food and food security to put their hands in their pockets and help it go through.
yeah, it is remarkable, isn't it, that the Labour Party are continuing with so many Tory policies, particularly as pertains to the food system and the environment. Because I don't think anybody that voted Labour wanted a continuation of what the Conservatives were doing. They stood on a platform of change, literally. That was their manifesto title, and
Yeah,
it
the
is
change
for
of
us.
Trump in America,
Yeah, which is
America first.
it's the same stuff but more extreme. Even I would say it's not Tory light, it's Tory faster.
The issue that the Tory party had when they tried to put the American trade deal through in 2020 under Boris Johnson was that the party split because of the rural seats, which were mostly Conservative,
Mm,
wouldn't do that because they knew they'd never get re-elected. Look, anyone that is concerned about our food security and the quality of our food needs to make sure that they back this judicial review. And if they can join us next Friday from 10 o'clock outside the High Court, and we will visibly be showing that farmers are the sacrificial lambs of these trade deals. So come to the High Court, Royal Courts of Justice on the Strand. We'll be there from 10 o'clock. Come and stand with us, cheer, and we might even have a run past the Australian High Commission, which is just on the other side of the Aldwych, just for the hell of it.
yes, and this is on the 7th of March,
7th of March, Friday,
2025. Yeah.
from 10 o'clock. And I also wouldn't be surprised, and this might be for next week's podcast, I would
Yeah.
be surprised if the Labour Party splits over the next couple of years.
Well, well, okay. There we go. Big talk. Wonderful. It's been a pleasure speaking to you, Liz, and I'll see you next week.
See you next week.